What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we just got a couple of updates for Codex Orks and the Imperial Armor Compendium over here on Warhammer Community on the FAQ Errata update page. And I just want to talk about them real quick because I think there's some interesting changes that were made and some changes that weren't made. So first off, looking at this Codex Orks update, this is an entirely new update, so we don't see any blue or magenta here because these are all new changes to the Ork Codex proper. Most of the changes are very minor. There's a little bit of wording cleanup. Things got moved around to different specialist mob types, and I don't believe that these are particularly impactful. Now, when the Ork Codex came out, I did talk about it in a big video. Not my best video ever. I was out of town at the time and didn't research things as much as I wanted to and got some stuff wrong, which is embarrassing. But some of the things that I brought up in that video and that I forgot to bring up in that video, even more embarrassing, were taken care of in this FAQ. So we see that the Grot Shield stratagem has been fixed. Previously, there was an interaction where you could Grot Shields with Makari, who is a 2+ invulnerable save. You could just make a entire unit basically have a 2+ invulnerable save, which is pretty good. That's been fixed so that you cannot target characters with that Grot Shield's ability. Thank goodness. Not that that interaction really came up, but I think there was some recipe for abuse there. We also had the interaction with Truck Boys repaired. Truck Boys obviously was a specialist mob of boys that was meant to work well in transports. Unfortunately, because they replaced their clan keyword with their specialist mob keyword, they actually couldn't embark on any transports. So that's been fixed. Now trucks at least can embark specialist mob infantry. We also saw a little bit of a nerf to the Kill Rig and Hunter Rig's snag ability. So previously there was a weird interaction between the snag ability and aircraft, because on a 4+, if you've dealt wounds to them in your shooting phase, then they cannot move more than 12 inches from the shooting model, which means that oftentimes an aircraft that was required to perform a minimum move would have to go into strategic reserve or die if you rolled that 4+ on them after dealing wounds. Now, obviously, you could reroll your hit rolls, I think, on this weapon, but it's still, super difficult to hit, especially if you're hitting a hard-to-hit aircraft. So not the biggest chance it happened ever. Then on top of that was also a 4+, and there had to be a particular angle that the aircraft was at to not be able to end within 12 inches of the kill rig. But if all of those came into play, you could be forcing aircraft off the table. That's been removed. So it no longer affects aircraft models. If you hit an aircraft with the weapon, it will just run away anyway. It doesn't really matter. In addition, there's this clause at the bottom that has been added where if the kill or hunter rig moves for any reason, the effect ends, which means that if in your shooting phase, your kill rig tags an enemy vehicle with this ability and then charges somewhere else, they immediately unsnag the vehicle that they hit previously. I think this was to stop potentially an interaction where you shoot something that's 12 inches away and then charge in the opposite direction, which would require the vehicle to move towards you. Although that's very thematic, it's probably a recipe for abuse in some situations where you can force enemies to stop moving or be locked in combat or something like that. Now, we also have some interesting FAQs in the FAQ section, one of which clarifying that custom jobs can't be given to a multi-model vehicle unit because there's a restriction in the custom job rule that they can only be given to a single model unit. This isn't a really huge deal because it's really just clarifying a rule that already exists, but it is good precedent for other abilities that are granted during a game that have restrictions on to whom they can be granted. A good example of this is Necrons and selecting duplicate Catan powers using strange echoes. This is kind of a point of contention around the community. Rules as written, according to the Catan power ability, you cannot select a Catan power more than once in a single game until you've selected all of the Catan powers, so essentially unless you have 3 Transcendent Catan shards. That's just a clause in the powers of the Catan ability, and there's no reason to believe that it wouldn't affect the Catan shards later on in the game after your muster army phase. And the same goes for these custom jobs. You cannot, when you're building your army, give a custom job to a single model unit, and during the game, you cannot also use an ability to give a custom job to a single model unit. So while I don't think this is a really big deal for the Ork Codex, I do think that it is good to set precedent that these interactions exist. So if you have any abilities that can grant restricted abilities over the course of the game, it's important to remember that those restrictions will still be imposed later on in the game as the game continues. Now, real quick, we'll also move over to the Imperial Armor Compendium here. There aren't a lot of changes. There have been some clarifications, basically, to bring stuff up to date. We see some of the Grey Knights vehicles referenced with the 9th edition Grey Knight Codex versus using old keywords, which is good, and basically we see that a lot with Orks as well. But there are some impactful changes here. The Warboss on the Warbike has lost his Warboss keyword. Previously, he had both the Warboss and the Speedboss keywords, which meant that he could potentially call either a Speedwa or a regular Wa. I think this is clearly unintended, so it's good that we've removed that. It is a little bit weird that he's still called a Warboss and a Warbike and isn't Warboss keyworded, but it makes a lot more sense that he would be a Speed Boss and not both the kinds of bosses. We also see basically all the vehicles losing their 8th edition Codex abilities and being upgraded to the 9th edition Codex abilities, so they're getting the Wa keyword, and they're getting the new versions of Here We Go and Ramshackle and all that stuff. Although, interestingly, we did see the Kill Tank lose the Ramshackle ability, which is a huge nerf to that thing. One of the really powerful things about the Kill Tank datasheet was that it had this ridiculously difficult to kill profile for not very many points, 270 points for the standard Kill Tank loadout for 24 wounds at toughness 8, with that Ramshackle basically being a 6+ damage ignore with extra steps, was super duper powerful. And then Ramshackle moving to that damage reduction ability meant that Kill Tank was going to be super good, especially if you didn't have strength 8 weaponry to shoot through Ramshackle. That said, we've lost it entirely, so Kill Tanks are getting an additional debuff on top of not really interacting super well with the updated Ork Codex abilities. So we may see less Kill Tanks on the table going forward, I think. Now, before we move on, the big thing that I do want to talk about is the Green Tide secondary objective. I talked about this at length in the previous video I did on the Ork Codex, and it's sort of an embarrassing rules hiccup that creates a lot of odd situations. The Green Tide secondary objective scores you 3 victory points at the end of the battle round if you're controlling 2 or more battlefield quarters with Ork units of 11 or more models, with those units being wholly within them. If you have all 4 table quarters, then you get 5 points instead. The issue is that this secondary objective tells the player who selected it to divide the battlefield into 4 even quarters. This is in stark contrast to any of the other table quarter referencing secondaries, like Engage on All Fronts, or Herd the Prey / Purge the Vermin from Necrons or Drukhari. Those just reference table quarters, but they don't instruct the player to define their own table quarters. Without the instruction to define your own, you're basically just left with the mission setup diagram, which does have table quarters defined. This Green Tide secondary having this one clause, which at the start of the battle tells the player to divide the battlefield into 4 even quarters, means that it seems like the implication of the secondary is that the Ork player is meant to divide the battlefield up into 4 parts as they wish. Now, obviously, there are some restrictions on how you can do that, but being able to divide the battlefield into 4 quarters by stripping it into 4 columns, all of which terminate in their own deployment zone, making it super easy to hold 3 or 4 of them, or even turning it into a bunch of triangles, again, all of which could terminate in the Ork player's deployment zone, makes this secondary laughably easy if you have an armyless composition that can score it accurately. Given that this wasn't addressed at all in the FAQ, and it includes this clause that no other table quarter secondary includes, leads me to believe that the intention is that it is played fundamentally differently than all of the other table quarter secondaries, which means to me the interpretation that you can define your own table quarters is entirely intended. So far, we haven't been seeing Green Tide be a huge deal in Ork lists, and I think that's specifically because the more mechanized Ork lists tend to be more powerful than the Horde versions that do have a lot of those 11+ model units. But if the paradigm were to shift and Orks were to take a lot more larger units, I think that the secondary becomes one of the most powerful ones in the game. But with that, I'd like to move over to the one remaining FAQ that's in this document here. And this is this one on the bottom about Brutal but Cunning as it interacts with the Goth sub-faction ability. This rules interaction was ridiculously complex when the Codex came out, and I think I complained about it a little bit in my previous video. It's basically a retread of the Competitive Edge Razor Flail combo that we saw in Drukhari be so super powerful. And while it's clearly not as good as that, it does open up some weird rules interactions that didn't really have any precedent in the rules and were very poorly defined. Basically, Brutal but Cunning is the Warlord trait that gives you an additional attack for each attack that did not deal damage. So any attack that you miss, fail to wound, or get saved, you will then basically pick that dice up and re-roll it again. No Mucking About, which is the Goff sub-faction ability, gives you additional hits on hit rolls of 6. So basically, the Warlord would roll all of his attacks, get additional hits for 6s, and then reroll any attacks that didn't deal damage. But the open question was, what happens to the extra attacks that were generated by the sub-faction ability? So I've jumped in Tabletop Simulator here to talk about how this interaction does work. So we have our war boss here, and he's rolled his set of 5 attacks at somebody, and he's rolled 2 6s. Now, thanks to No Mucking About, those 2 6s would generate additional attacks. Now, we're going to go ahead and go through our wound roll. We do have 1 missed attack here, so we're going to put that on the side to reroll thanks to Brutal but Cunning. We're going to roll our wound rolls. We'll say wound on 3s. So we'll have 3 more that fail. These would go to saves, assuming that they all pass through. His AP is probably pretty high. We would then generate 4 additional attacks thanks to Brutal but Cunning. We would roll those, but any 6s that we roll, so if we said we rolled a 6 here, that would not explode because additional attacks can't be generated by these additional attacks generated from Brutal but Cunning. The other possible interpretation would be the other way around, where the exploded attacks would not get rerolled thanks to the Brutal but Cunning, but any explosions here would generate additional hits. But GW has elected to rule the opposite way. I do think that there's solid precedent to rule either way. So while when I was asked the question, I actually ruled the opposite direction, I think both ways are sort of mechanically similar, and there's a good reason to rule either way. It's good that we do have an official ruling, but it does set the precedent that anything that triggers an additional hit is meant to trigger basically anything an additional attack would, which is kind of a big deal. We do have to keep in mind that there are restrictions placed on additional hits by the scoring additional hits advanced rule, but I'm sure that there will be some interactions in the future for which this interaction is very relevant. But anyway, that's all I have to say about the new Ork Codex. I just wanted to do a real quick video on it to talk about the changes that were and were not made. I think it's important to follow up on some of this stuff that was left wide open by the initial Codex release, which was kind of a mess. There's a lot of sort of mechanical weirdness about this Ork Codex that I'm not sure was entirely intended, and it doesn't really feel like it follows a lot of the design philosophies that Games Workshop set out before. And also, that Green Tide secondary not being rolled on is kind of a travesty. That's super embarrassing, actually. But anyway, I'll go ahead and close off the video there. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Big thanks to everyone who keeps the channel going, YouTube channel members that you can join down below the video, Patreons at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are awesome. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.